So far in this course, we have been exploring state. We have learned how to create and manage state in our functional components using the useState hook. And in the previous lesson, we got to understand the concept of asynchronous state, and we saw how that can improve the performance of our application. Well, in this lesson, we're going to be looking at how to manage state in controlled components. And before we begin, the first thing to understand is what exactly is a controlled component, or what is an uncontrolled component. I'm going to be using some input examples here, so let me run my development server. Now, when it comes to controlled and uncontrolled components, they usually apply to form elements like inputs, your radio buttons, your checkboxes, your select, input, text area, all those elements. For this video, we're going to be focusing on a text input and a checkbox, but you should also understand that this concept can apply to other inputs. Now, what I've simply done here is comment the previous code that we have for the app components. So all of that is commented, and then I created a new app component here. I have this div with a class of block, and then I have these two inputs. The first one with the type of text, the second one with the type of checkbox. So this is the style I have for it so far. The previous styles, I can comment them since I am not using them at the moment. So when we started exploring states, I explained that normal HTML elements like your inputs have state of their own. So even before React or other frameworks existed, the concept of state has always existed in normal HTML elements. Now, looking at this input to the type of text, currently it's in an empty state. But then when I type into it, it now has a state where the value property has a value of Deecode. Also coming to this input, currently it has a state where the checked property is false. But if I click on the checkbox, now the checked state of this element becomes true, and if I click on it again, it becomes false. So where does the controlled or uncontrolled concept apply here? Well, when we use this input here in our React component, currently this input is uncontrolled, and this means that the input is managing its own state by itself. This text input, this checkbox input, they are managing their state by themselves. React is not managing the state of these elements. They are managing their own internal state by themselves. So we call them uncontrolled, which means React is not controlling their internal state. But then when we instruct React to manage their state, this is where these elements or components become controlled. You might be thinking, well, how do we turn this from an uncontrolled element to a controlled element? Well, for this input to the type of text, if we put a value here, and for this value we put a string, this input element is now controlled. Here we are telling React in this our app component, when you have this input element, apply a value of Deecode. For this checkbox, instead of using the value property, what we'll use is the checked property. So if I put the checked property and I put a value of true, now this checkbox becomes a controlled element. React is now controlling the internal state of this checkbox because we have defined the state of the checked property to be true. Here we define the state of the value property to be Deecode. But now that this is controlled by React, something interesting is going to happen. If I come to this input here and I try to type into it, nothing is going to work. I am currently typing into it even if you cannot see my keyboard. I come here, I'm trying to put text, but React is like, nope. I am in control of this element, and the value of this element will always stay as Deecode. So because React is controlling it now, the element loses its own control. Remember when the element had a control of its own, we could change the values. The element was managing its own state. Now React is managing the state, and that means the element loses its own ability to control its state. And same thing for this checkbox. I'm currently clicking this checkbox. You can probably see that click interaction happening, but the checkbox refuses to be unchecked. That is because here I have specified that the checked state in my app component here, I've specified that the checked state to be true, so the element now loses its own ability to control its state. The state is now being controlled by React. Now, if I don't want to turn this to a controlled element, but I still want to specify like a default value, this is where using a property like default value comes in. So if I specify default value with a value of Deecode, and let me take this away, coming back to this place, you see that the default value is Deecode, but then I can still type into it. So when you specify a default value here, what you're saying is this input should have a default value of Deecode, but don't turn this input into a controlled component or element. This input will still maintain the ability to control its own state. And the same concept applies here. If I use default checked and I apply true here, this is still going to stay as an uncontrolled element. So now I can uncheck and check, uncheck and check. Later on in this course, we would see where using default value or difference checked can be useful, but let's just stay on this since we are talking about controlled components. But then what if I wanted to change the value of this input, or I wanted to change the checked state of this checkbox? Since this is now being managed by React, it means I have to tell React when it should change the state. If I just put a value of Deecode here, React is going to say the value of this input is always going to be Deecode. But then if I want a different value at a later time based on an event or something, then I have to tell React, hey, since you're in control of this element, please change the value of this input element from this to that. And this is where we can now introduce states. As we have learned so far in states, you have something like this. You have the useState hook, you specify a default value, and then here we can destructure the returned array from this useState. So let's call this value, and then we call the set function set value. Now let's say we had a button here, update value. I'm going to give this a class name, update value button. So I can come here now and do update value button. I'm just doing some styles here. Okay, let's say we have this basic style here for this button. Now I can say that when you click this button, I'm going to have a callback function here. I'm using an arrow function in this case. I could choose to also create a function here and use that function to handle the event, but let me just create the function directly here. So when you click on this button in this callback function, I'm going to do set value, and then I'm going to pass something like simple stuff. And here in this input, instead of using a hard-coded value like this, I can now use the value state. Don't forget, React is managing the state of this input in this case. So now this has Deecode. Of course, I cannot change it because React is still controlling the state of that input, and this value is coming from this place here. So now when I click on this button, this is going to update the value state to simple stuff, and watch what happens to the input now. When I click on this, the input becomes simple stuff, because like we already understand, by updating the state of value, the app component is going to be re-rendered, and in that second render, since value now holds a value of simple stuff, that simple stuff is now going to be attached to this value property. So we have simple stuff, but I still cannot change it. So even if I'm trying to type, I still cannot change it. The state is still being managed by React. And we can apply a similar concept for the checked state. So here I'm going to say update checked, and I'll call this update checked button. So here I can keep a state called checked with my set state to be set checked. By default, this should have a value of true. And then here I can call set checked, and let's just say I negate the current checked state. So let me just come here and repeat this update checked button. So here, instead of hard coding true, I'm going to pass the checked state, which is coming from here. So by default, the checked state is true. If I click on this, the checked state becomes false, right? Now look at that input is now unchecked. And because the checked state is false now, if I click on this again, it becomes true. But if I click on this directly, it's not going to change that checked state, because this input element can no longer manage its own internal state. It is now React managing the state of that element. This now introduces us to the concept of data binding, and in this case we have a one-way data binding. What does one-way data binding mean here? It means that we have a state, and then we are binding that state to this input. Same thing for the checked, from state to input. But how can we also get the other way around? So from the input to the state. So that way users can type something, and when you type it from here, it will go to the state. And also when you click on this, it goes from here to the states. Now that is where you're going to have a two-way data binding. Two-way data binding means from state to input, from input to state. If you update the state, it will reflect in the input. If you update the input, it will reflect in the state. And because it is reflecting in the state, it is still going to reflect in the input. So you can see that two-way connection between the state and the input. And how do you do this? Well, this is where you can listen to the change event on input. So for this first input, I can have on change, and then I have a callback function. This callback function is going to receive an argument, which is the event object. And on this event object, we can have access to this input on the target property. So I can say const target is equals to event.target. This event.target is going to refer to this input where the event was triggered. I have a video on event.target where I dived into more detail. I'll link it below if you want to learn more about the event target object. So let's just say I do console log target. So here I'm in the console, I'm in the input here. This change event is triggered when I want to change the state of that input, which in this case is the text. Now let's say I type the letter S. Now by typing S, of course S doesn't show in the input because React is going to be like, I am in control. You cannot change this value. I am the only one that can change this value. But then you can see that because that event was still triggered, here we have this input, which is the event.target. So here what I can do is I can do object destructuring. I also have a video on object destructuring. You can check it below. So instead of doing const target is equals to event.target, I can just destructure the event object and extract the target property. And then here I can now say set value. Let me close this, and then I have target.value. Or instead of doing it like this, I don't even need to object destructure here. I can just say set value event.target.value. Again, this target would refer to this input where the event was triggered, right? And then this value is going to be the value property that would have been the state of the input when the event was triggered. Don't forget, when I try to type into this input, a change event is triggered and the input attempts to update its internal state with the new value. But because React is controlling it, React is going to ignore that state update from the input. So here when I have this on change and I have this event.target.value is going to refer to the new value that would have been the state of the input if it was uncontrolled. Since I'm now doing set value event.target.value, this is where I am introducing that two-way binding. When you attempt to change the text on the input, this is going to update the value state. By updating the value state, this component will be re-rendered, and since it will be re-rendered, that new value state is now going to be used here. And this way, I can be able to type into the input. So now I can type anything I would like to type. So from event to state to input, to state to input, to state to input, two-way binding. We can apply the same idea here. So here we can have on change, and then we have a callback function. In this callback function, we're going to say set checked, and then we're going to pass event.target.checked. Or we missed the event object here. So now I can remove these buttons. Since I now have this two-way binding between the checkbox and this state, now I can uncheck the checkbox and check the checkbox. But the idea still remains that React is now the one controlling this component. It is not the component or the element controlling its internal state by itself. It's React controlling this because we have enabled this two-way data binding between the input and the checkbox, between the state and the checkbox, and same thing between the state and this input here. Now you're probably thinking, why would you want to go through all this stress of converting an uncontrolled element to a controlled element? Well, there are a lot of cases where you don't need to do this, and we're going to be looking at those cases in future videos. But converting an uncontrolled element to a controlled element can be useful when you want to use the internal state of that element for something else, something outside the element. And I'm going to show you a few examples. Now let's say whatever you type here, you wanted it to also reflect on the DOM somewhere here. So let's just say I had a paragraph, and now in this paragraph I can also render the value. Let's say this has a class name of para, so I'm just going to come here and do para color orange. So what do you notice here? You can now see that because we are managing this value state in the component, which is React now, we can now use this value state somewhere else. So in this case, we can use it here, and then watch what happens. If the input is empty, the paragraph is empty, then I can now type my name is Deeecode. Because I've created that two-way binding, I now have access to the value state, and I can use that value state outside the input. So I'm using it here. We have probably seen this in some websites where you search for something and then you get something like you searched for, and then you have quotes, and then you put this value inside like this. And now you can see currently it's empty. You searched for Deeecode. I can use that state outside. Another reason why you might want to convert an uncontrolled element to a controlled element is maybe you want to do something to the data that the user enters. Let's say, for example, you want a user to enter a text here, but that text should not contain any numbers. Let me comment this part for now. Now, in that case, if you leave the element as uncontrolled, the user can type 50. There are also other ways you can avoid this. I'm not saying converting it to a controlled element is the only way, but it's one of the patterns that you would see a lot when it comes to building applications with React. So in this case now, let me move this callback function from here to here. So let's say I have a function called update value. This is going to take the event objects, and then here I can do the normal set value events.target.value. So instead of having this here, I can just pass the update value handler. Now in this case, I can first get access to the value. So const, and I'm doing some object destructuring here. Again, I have a video in the description if you want to learn more about object destructuring. I first destructure the target property in the event object, then I destructure the value property in the target object. Or you know what, just to make this video easy, let me skip this destructuring, but I'm going to use it in future lessons though. So const value is equals to event.target.value. This is the same thing as what I just did a few seconds ago. Here I can now say that if the value contains a number, then don't update the value state. There are various ways you can do that, but I like using regular expressions. I know regular expressions is not everyone's favorite language or tool, but I have a simplified course on regular expressions. You can find it on simpleregex.com if you're interested. But here I can create a number regex. So I'll just call this number regex, and this is simply going to be this. This is a simple number regex. This is a meta character for digits, which is 0 to 9. And then now I can say that if numReg.test value, if that is true, then do nothing. But if it is false, then I'm going to set the value to value. So here I am testing if this value string has any numbers in it. And if it has any number, like I said, do nothing. But if it doesn't have any number, set this. We start from Deeecode. If I type letters, well, everything is working fine. But if I attempt to press 5 on my keyboard, you can see that 5 doesn't show here. And just to show you that I'm actually pressing 5, if I do console log value, let's say I have my console open now. If I type A, you can see we have decode A. If I come to this point here and I type Y, you can see I have dy code blah blah blah. Now if I type 1 here, you can see that by having access to the value, we actually have 1 at the end. But I do not update the state of the value immediately. Instead, I first check, does this contain a number? Or it actually contains a number, then don't do anything. But if it doesn't contain a number, then set this. So now if I type other characters like H, V, you see everything is working fine. Every other thing is working fine. But when I try to introduce a number like 9, you see that we actually have the value as 9. But because React is controlling the state in this case, we can say because this includes a number, don't add 9 there. And you've probably seen this in a lot of websites where you try to enter certain numbers and it just doesn't work. You try to do certain things and it just doesn't work. Again, there might be various ways these websites are doing it, but when you are controlling your elements in this case, then it makes it easy for you to do or for you to make such decisions. Instead of typing everything like this, I can just reduce everything to this, then set value. So instead of having that long block, I can just say if this test returns false, so that's why I have this negate here. So if it returns false, then this negate is going to make it true. That means this condition is true. It runs this. But then if this test returns true, which means there is a number, this negate is now going to make it false, and then this condition doesn't run. So let's try this again. If I try to type numbers, if I try to type letters, it's working. If I try to type numbers, yep, nothing happens. Now here we have looked at a normal text input input and a checkbox input, but you can apply the same concept of controlled elements or controlled components to other input types, so radio boxes, select, range input, email input, and a bunch of others. And we're going to look at those in future videos, but I hope that this concept now makes sense to you.